99 women had walked into Alistair Croft's estate with a dowry and left with a rejection. He wasn't just a duke, he was a brick wall dressed in silk, turning high society into a graveyard of broken engagements. Bexley Linfield didn't come with a dowry. She came with a bruised knuckle, a headache, and zero patience. Gravel crunched beneath the carriage wheels, a rhythmic grinding sound that vibrated straight into Bexley's aching shins. The air inside the cab smelled of damp wool and old horse sweat, clinging to the heavy winter cloak she had borrowed from her aunt. It was too large, its stiff collar scraping relentlessly against her jawline. She adjusted it for the 5th time, her bare fingers stiff with cold. She had forgotten her gloves, a stupid, trivial mistake that made her feel absurdly vulnerable. Alistair Croft, the Duke of Oakhaven, lived in a fortress of limestone and ivy that looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum. As the carriage jerked to a halt, Bexley pressed her thumb against her index finger, biting at a tiny strip of peeling skin until a sharp sting grounded her. She wasn't here out of romance. Romance was a luxury afforded to women who didn't have a ledger of debts sitting on their dining table. She was here because society dictated that a formal audience with the Duke, even an unsuccessful one, granted a family a 6-month grace period from their creditors. It was an unspoken rule of the peerage. If Oakhaven was considering you, the hounds backed off. The heavy oak doors groaned open before she even reached the top step. A footman with dead eyes ushered her inside. The grand hall was draughty, smelling faintly of beeswax and old coins. "Miss Linfield," a dry voice echoed. Thomas Gable, the Duke's secretary, stood at the top of the stairs. He looked like a man who hadn't slept since the turn of the century, the skin under his eyes the colour of bruised plums. "He will see you in the study." "Thank you," Bexley said, her throat tight and raspy. As she followed Thomas down a long corridor, a door opened ahead of them. A young lady burst out, shoving a handkerchief against her nose, her shoulders hitching in silent, ugly sobs. The scent of heavy, cloying rosewater trailed behind her. 99. That made 99 rejections. Bexley was number 100. Thomas didn't blink. He simply stepped aside, gesturing towards the open door. Bexley stepped into the study. The room was suffocatingly warm, dominated by a crackling hearth and the overpowering smell of burning pine. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, stacked on shelves and piling up on the floor like architectural ruins. Behind a sprawling desk of dark mahogany sat Alistair Croft. He didn't look up immediately. He was scraping the nib of a fountain pen against a blotter, a maddeningly loud sound in the quiet room. He didn't possess the chiseled marble perfection the gossip rags claimed. His jaw was covered in a shadow of stubble, his dark hair messy, and ink stained his right index finger. He looked exhausted, bored, and utterly detached. "Have a seat, Miss Linfield," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, but it dragged, lacking any inflection. Bexley sat in the stiff leather wingback chair opposite him. Alistair finally looked up. His eyes were a muted, flat grey. He didn't scan her face or look at her dress. He looked at her the way one looks at a ledger entry. "I have read the proposal forwarded by your father," Alistair said, leaning back. He picked up a sheet of thick parchment, tapping the edge against the desk. "The Linfield estate in exchange for an alliance. It is thorough. The terms are clear." Bexley held her breath. She didn't want to marry him. She just needed him to drag out the process. "We believe it would be mutually beneficial, Your Grace. The northern timber borders your existing—" "No." The word dropped into the room like a lead weight. Bexley blinked. "Excuse me." "No," Alistair repeated, tossing the parchment onto a pile of similar rejections. I must decline your proposal, Miss Linfield. I wish you the best of luck in your future endeavours. Thomas will see you out. He reached for his pen. He was already dismissing her. He hadn't even let her finish a sentence. The dismissal wasn't just cold, it was mechanical. A hot, prickly sensation crawled up the back of Bexley's neck. She looked at the top of his head as he began writing something else. The sheer arrogance of it, the absolute lack of humanity. She had spent 3 weeks agonizing over this meeting, pacing the floorboards of her crumbling house, enduring her father's desperate, alcohol-laced rants, practicing her exact cadence so she wouldn't sound desperate. When he handed her the same practiced dismissal, she didn't cry. She stood up, stepped across the desk, and slapped him so hard his signet ring rattled against the mahogany desk. And he gave her 30 seconds and a no. "That's it?" Bexley asked, her voice dropping a register, losing the polite society polish she had carefully applied. Alistair paused, pen hovering. He looked back up, a faint line appearing between his brows. "I believe I was clear. I am declining. You didn't even listen to the timber yields." "I don't care about the timber yields." "Then why did you take the meeting?" Bexley felt her hands balling into fists in her lap. Her ungloved knuckles ached. "Why do you take any of these meetings? You've rejected 99 women before me. Do you enjoy it? Does it make you feel powerful, sitting behind this desk, watching people beg?" Alistair sighed, a slow, rattling sound. "I am not obligated to explain my calendar to you, Miss Linfield. Good day." He looked back down. Something inside Bexley snapped. It wasn't a heroic, righteous anger. It was an ugly, exhaustion-fueled rage. The scratch of his pen grated against her eardrums. The heat of the fire felt suddenly oppressive, choking her. She stood up. Her chair scraped violently against the wooden floorboards. Alistair didn't flinch, but his eyes flicked upward just in time to see her cross the short distance. Bexley didn't think. If she had thought, she would have remembered the social ruin, the potential lawsuits, the sheer scandal of assaulting a peer of the realm. But all she saw was the bored, dismissive slant of his mouth. Her hand swung in a tight, fast arc. The crack of her palm against his jaw echoed like a gunshot in the stuffy room. It wasn't a delicate, theatrical slap. It was hard, sloppy, and entirely unrefined. The base of her palm caught his cheekbone, her fingers slapping across his ear. Alistair's head snapped to the side. The heavy gold signet ring on his left hand, which had been resting near the edge of the desk, knocked against the mahogany as he jolted back. A profound, heavy silence crashed down on the room. The only sound was the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, and the sudden, shallow hitch of Bexley's own breathing. Pain flared instantly in Bexley's hand. A hot, throbbing sting radiated from her palm down to her wrist. She stood there, her arm frozen in the air for a second too long, her chest heaving. Immediate, sickening regret flooded her stomach. She lowered her hand slowly, curling her stinging fingers inward. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "You fool," she thought. "You stupid, impulsive fool." Alistair didn't yell. He didn't jump up and call for the guards. He stayed perfectly still, his head turned toward the bookshelves. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he brought his hand up and pressed 2 ink-stained fingers against his cheek. When he turned his face back to her, a distinct red mark was already blooming across his pale skin, the outline of her fingers stark against his jaw. His grey eyes were wide. The flat, dead look was gone, replaced by a jarring, sharp clarity. He looked at her, not with anger, but with profound, genuine shock. "Did you just hit me?" he asked. His voice was very quiet, the baritone stripped of its usual smooth veneer. You aren't listening to them, Bexley said. Her voice trembled, and she hated it. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest to hide the shaking, digging her fingernails into the wool of her oversized coat. You aren't listening to any of us. You sit here, playing some twisted game. Tell me the truth. Why are you collecting rejections like morbid trophies? The door creaked open behind her. Your Grace, I heard a... Thomas stopped dead in the doorway. He took in the scene. Bexley standing rigid, breathing hard, and the Duke of Oakhaven touching a bright red handprint on his face. Close the door, Thomas, Alistair said. He didn't take his eyes off Bexley. Sir, should I... Close the door. Thomas retreated, the heavy oak clicking shut with a soft snick. Alistair stood up. He was taller than Bexley had realized, his frame casting a long shadow across the worn Persian rug. He walked around the desk, his movements slow, almost cautious. The smell of his cologne, bergamot, black pepper, and old paper, became stronger as he approached. Bexley forced herself to hold her ground. She wanted to step back, to put distance between them, but backing down now felt like conceding. She tilted her chin up, meeting his stare. Her hand still burned. You have a rather aggressive method of negotiation, Miss Linfield, he murmured, stopping a few feet away. It wasn't a negotiation, Bexley shot back, though her voice lacked its earlier bite. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a cold sweat on the back of her neck. It was a wake-up call. You dismiss people without looking at them. You treated me like a nuisance. I am a human being. My family is starving. And you couldn't grant me 30 seconds of genuine consideration. Alistair studied her. He looked at the oversized, cheap wool coat. He looked at her bare hands, noticing the rough cuticles and the slight tremor in her fingers. He looked at the redness in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the heat of the fire. He dropped his hand from his bruised face. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but a break in the armor. You're right, he said. Bexley blinked. The fight drained out of her, leaving her utterly bewildered. What? You're right, Alistair repeated, turning away from her. He walked toward a side table where a crystal decanter caught the flickering light of the hearth. I wasn't looking at you. I haven't looked at anyone who has walked into this room for 3 months. He pulled the stopper from the decanter. The sharp, sweet smell of amber brandy spilled into the air, mingling with the pine smoke. He poured 2 glasses, the amber liquid splashing heavily against the crystal. He turned back and held one out to her. Drink, he said softly. You look as though you're going to faint, and if you collapse on my rug, Thomas will assume I murdered you in retaliation. Bexley stared at the glass. She didn't trust him. She didn't trust the sudden shift in the atmosphere. But the throbbing in her hand was a constant distraction, and her knees felt dangerously unmoored. She reached out and took the glass. Her fingers brushed against his, and she felt a brief, startling warmth. His skin was calloused, entirely unlike the soft hands of the aristocrats she occasionally danced with at provincial assemblies. She took a sip. The brandy burned, going down, leaving a trail of fire in her throat, but it settled warmly in her empty stomach. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the alcohol steady her nerves. Alistair leaned against the edge of his desk, crossing his long legs at the ankles. He took a sip of his own drink, wincing slightly as the alcohol touched the side of his mouth. You pack quite a punch, he muttered, rubbing his jaw again. I apologize, Bexley said stiffly. It was unseemly. It was the most honest thing anyone has done in this house since my father died, Alistair corrected. He stared down into his glass, swirling the liquid. The firelight caught in the crystal, throwing fractured shadows across his waistcoat. You demanded the truth, Miss Linfield. I did. Sit down, he ordered, nodding toward the chair she had vacated. Bexley hesitated, then sat back down. The leather felt a little less cold this time. She gripped the glass with both hands, waiting. Alistair looked at the ceiling, taking a slow breath. He looked incredibly tired, the heavy weight of the estate seeming to press down directly onto his shoulders. "I don't enjoy the rejections," he started, his voice barely above a murmur. "I don't collect them as trophies. I hate every Tuesday. I hate the smell of the perfumes. I hate the trembling hands holding out ledger books. And I hate the tears." "Then why do you do it?" Bexley asked, leaning forward slightly. "No one is forcing you to hold court. You're a duke. You answer to the crown, not the gossip mongers." Alistair gave a short, bitter laugh. "I answer to a piece of paper locked in the royal archives. My father's will." He took another drink, swallowing heavily. "The estate is encumbered, heavily. The wealth you see, the limestone, the servants, the land, it's locked in a trust. The terms of the trust are archaic and incredibly specific. I cannot access the principal capital until I am married." Bexley frowned. "That isn't a secret. Half the ton knows Oakhaven is looking for a bride. That's why the queue stretches down the gravel drive. They know I need a bride," Alistair said, his grey eyes locking onto hers. "They don't know the second clause. The marriage cannot be purely transactional. My father was a romantic, naive fool until his dying breath. He was terrified I would marry an heiress just to secure the funds and live a miserable, separate life the way his own brother did. So he added a stipulation. The union must be verified by the trust's executor, my uncle, who loathes me and stands to inherit if I fail." Bexley's grip on her glass tightened. "Verified how?" "My uncle must be convinced that the match is genuine." Alistair spat the word as if it tasted foul. "That there is affection, compatibility, a shared spark, as the dreadful man puts it." He pushed off the desk and began to pace. The floorboards groaned softly under his boots. "So," Alistair continued, gesturing vaguely in the air, "I opened the doors, I let them come. The daughters of earls, the merchant heiresses, the desperate, the ambitious, 99 of them, and every single one walked into this room, looked at the mahogany, looked at the crest on the wall, and recited a speech their mothers wrote for them. They smiled with dead eyes. They offered dowries, timber, shipping routes, political alliances. They treated me like a bank vault that needed unlocking." He stopped pacing and turned to face Bexley. "How am I supposed to convince a cynical, greedy executor that I have found a genuine, passionate match when every woman who sits in that chair treats the interaction like a business merger? If I marry any of them, my uncle will see right through the farce. He will declare the terms unmet, dissolve the trust, and Oakhaven goes bankrupt. Thousands of tenants lose their homes. I lose everything." The room grew quiet again, save for the crackling of the pine logs. The scent of smoke and brandy hung heavy between them. Bexley absorbed the information. The contradiction of it all made her head spin. He was rejecting them not out of arrogance, but out of a desperate paralysis. He was searching for a needle in a haystack of carefully rehearsed societal performances. "And me?" Bexley asked quietly. "I came in here offering timber. I gave you the same business merger." "You did," Alistair agreed. He set his empty glass down on the desk with a soft clink. "But then I dismissed you, and instead of crying softly into a lace handkerchief, or curtsying and walking away to plot a better scheme..." He touched his cheek again, a genuine wry smile finally breaking through the gloom on his face. "You hit me." Bexley felt a flush creeping up her neck. "I lost my temper. It isn't a strategy, Your Grace. It's a character flaw." "It was real," Alistair said. He walked back to his chair and sat down heavily, leaning his elbows on the desk. He looked at her, truly looking at her for the first time. He noticed the frayed edges of her coat. He noticed the way she held her jaw tight, defensive and proud, despite her obvious exhaustion. "Miss Linfield," Alistair said, his tone shifting, becoming sharper, more focused. "You mentioned your family is starving. You need the grace period my consideration affords. You need money." Bexley's spine stiffened. "I don't want your pity." "I am not offering pity. I am proposing a transaction, ironically enough." Alistair leaned forward, bridging the gap across the mahogany. "You do not want to marry me. You clearly despise me, and I do not know you from a stranger on the street." "A beautiful foundation for a courtship," Bexley muttered dryly. Alistair chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that startled her. "Exactly. My uncle expects me to find a woman who fawns over me. He expects a predictable, docile, aristocratic match. He is prepared to dismantle those. He is not prepared for a woman who looks ready to murder me for ignoring her timber yields." Bexley stared at him, the pieces slowly clicking together in her mind. "You want to use my hostility. I want to use your honesty," Alistair corrected softly. "If I present a bride who flatters me, he will call it a lie. But if I present a woman who challenges me, who argues with me in front of him, who clearly possesses no reverence for my title, but chooses to stay anyway, he won't know what to make of it. He will believe it's real, because no one would orchestrate a match so volatile." He held her gaze, the grey in his eyes no longer flat, but sharp as chipped flint. "I need someone who isn't afraid of me, Bexley, and you just left a handprint on my face." Alistair laid his hands flat on the desk. "Let me court you, officially. Let me bring you into society, argue with you at every ball, and convince my uncle that I have lost my mind over a woman who barely tolerates me. When the trust unlocks, I will settle your family's debts in full. You will never have to wear a borrowed coat again." Bexley looked down at her hands. The sting in her palm had faded to a dull, warm throb. She looked back up at the Duke. He wasn't a brick wall anymore. He was a man trapped in a burning house, handing her a bucket. She took a slow breath, tasting the lingering ash in the air. "If we are doing this," Bexley said, her voice steady, "you are going to read the report on the northern timber yields." Alistair's smile widened, reaching his eyes for the very first time. "Deal." Stiff velvet rubbed raw against the underside of Bexley's arms. The gown was an emerald monstrosity of heavy draping and rigid boning, purchased 2 days prior with a draft from Alistair's personal account. It fit perfectly, which only made it more irritating. It felt like armour. It felt like a lie. She sat at the long dining table in the Mayfair townhouse of Lord Reginald Croft, Alistair's uncle, and the sole executor of the Oakhaven Trust. The dining room was oppressively opulent. Gilded mirrors bounced the harsh light of 50 beeswax candles around the room, making Bexley's eyes ache. The air tasted of roasted lamb, heavy brown gravy, and the sharp, medicinal bite of Reginald's favourite claret. Reginald sat at the head of the table, methodically sawing into his meat. He was a thick-necked man with thinning grey hair and pale, watery eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He smelled of stale tobacco and expensive pomade. "I must admit, Alistair," Reginald drawled, pointing a silver fork toward his nephew. "When Thomas informed me you had finally made a selection, I expected an announcement involving the Duke of Westmore's daughter, or perhaps the Cavendish heiress. I did not expect a Linfield." He pronounced her surname as though he had found a bone in his fish. Bexley tightened her grip on her napkin. Beneath the table, her knee bounced in a restless, jagged rhythm. Alistair sat next to her, looking painfully bored. He wore a dark charcoal coat that absorbed the candlelight. He reached for his wine, his long fingers wrapping around the crystal stem. "The Cavendish heiress has the personality of a damp sponge, Uncle," Alistair replied, his voice a smooth, flat drawl. "And Westmore's daughter kept insisting she could fix my melancholic disposition by reading me poetry. I would rather step into traffic." Reginald's eyes narrowed. He shifted his gaze to Bexley, dissecting her. "And Miss Linfield? Does she not read poetry?" "I prefer ledgers, my lord," Bexley interjected. She didn't look at Alistair. That was part of their agreement. They were not to act like swooning lovers. They were to act like two jagged stones grinding against one another. "Poetry doesn't pay the butcher's bills. And frankly, your nephew's disposition is his own problem. I have no intention of fixing him." Alistair let out a sharp, genuine snort of amusement into his wineglass. Reginald's fork froze halfway to his mouth. "You speak rather boldly for a woman whose family estate is teetering on the edge of foreclosure, young lady." "Poverty breeds pragmatism, Lord Reginald," Bexley shot back, her voice tightening. She felt a flash of real, unscripted anger. The patronizing tilt of the older man's head dug into her pride like a rusty hook. "I am marrying a title and a trust fund. He is marrying a woman who won't bother him with trivialities or weep when he locks himself in his study for days on end. It is a highly efficient arrangement." "Efficient," Reginald repeated. He set his fork down with a loud clatter. The sound echoed off the high plaster ceiling. "A marriage is not a factory floor, Miss Linfield. The trust stipulates a genuine connection, affection, a meeting of minds, not a hostile corporate merger." "Hostile," Alistair chimed in. He set his glass down and turned to Bexley. He leaned in slightly, invading her space. The scent of his bergamot cologne cut through the heavy smell of the gravy. "Are you hostile, darling?" The endearment was laced with barbed wire. Bexley met his grey eyes. They were completely, entirely alive, dancing with a reckless, cynical energy. He was enjoying this. The bastard was actually having fun. "I am only hostile when you chew with your mouth open, Your Grace," Bexley replied sweetly, baring her teeth in a facsimile of a smile. Alistair barked a laugh, slapping a hand against the mahogany table. "You see, Uncle, she keeps me thoroughly disciplined. The Cavendish girl would have simply let me choke." Reginald looked between them, his face a mask of profound confusion. He was searching for the lie. He was looking for the secret, whispered assurances, the hidden touches under the tablecloth that marked a traditional, deceptive courtship. He found none. Bexley sat rigid, entirely closed off. Alistair looked at her not with adoration, but with a sharp, combative respect. It was entirely backward, and because it was backward, it was working. "This is absurd," Reginald muttered, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. "You two look as though you're preparing to duel, not walk down an aisle." "We can do both," Alistair offered lightly. "I have a lovely pair of dueling pistols in the armory. Bexley can have first shot." "I wouldn't miss," Bexley muttered, taking a sip of her water. "It was lukewarm." "I know you wouldn't," Alistair said softly. And for a fraction of a second, the performance slipped. The sarcasm drained from his tone, leaving behind a quiet, heavy sincerity that anchored Bexley to her chair. She felt a strange flutter in her chest, an involuntary reaction to the sudden drop in his voice. She ignored it, forcing herself to focus on the cold silver of her fork. Reginald watched the micro-expression pass between them. He frowned, leaning back in his chair, his thick fingers steepled over his stomach. He didn't look convinced, but, more importantly, he didn't look dismissive. He looked intrigued. The trap had been set. Iron wheels clattered unevenly over the rutted London streets, sending violent shudders through the wooden frame of the carriage. Inside, the darkness was absolute, save for the fleeting orange slashes of passing street lamps. The space smelled of damp leather and the fading ghost of Alistair's cologne. Bexley sagged against the squabs. The stiff velvet of her dress dug mercilessly into her ribs. With a harsh exhale, she reached behind her back and unfastened the top 3 hooks of the bodice. The immediate rush of cold air against her skin was euphoric. "Scandalous, Miss Linfield," a voice murmured from the opposite bench. Alistair was a shadowed silhouette across from her. He had shed his top hat and loosened his own cravat the moment the carriage door had closed. He sounded exhausted. The reckless energy he had wielded at the dinner table was entirely gone, leaving behind a hollow weariness. "If you wish to report me to the Modesty Police, do it tomorrow," Bexley said, rubbing her temples. A dull headache throbbed behind her eyes. "My skull feels as though your uncle spent the last 2 hours striking it with a mallet." "Reginald has that effect on people," Alistair agreed. The carriage hit a pothole, throwing Bexley forward slightly. Her knee bumped against his. Neither of them pulled away immediately. The heavy wool of his trousers was rough against the silk of her skirts. A sharp scrape of sulphur filled the small cabin, followed by the flare of a match. Alistair touched the flame to a small oil lamp mounted on the carriage wall. Weak yellow light spilled over them, casting long bruised shadows under his eyes. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers. He tossed it onto her lap. The thick parchment landed with a soft, heavy thwack. Bexley frowned, squinting at the documents. She recognized her own messy, hurried handwriting on the top page. It was the proposal she had brought to his estate. The timber yields. "Page 4, Alistair said, leaning back and crossing his arms. Bexley stared at him, bewildered. She slowly opened the packet, flipping past the initial terms of alliance. Page 4. A detailed breakdown of the Linfield estate's debts. Your father's creditors are predominantly holding promissory notes with a compounding interest rate of 12%, Alistair stated, his voice devoid of emotion, operating entirely on logic. It's predatory. They knew he was desperate. Bexley felt her throat close. The shame was sudden and acidic. It was one thing to leverage her family's poverty as a weapon against his uncle. It was quite another to have Alistair sit in the dim carriage and casually dissect her father's failures. "Why are you looking at this?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. She gathered the papers, wanting to shove them back at him. "Because we have a contract," Alistair replied evenly. "I promise to settle your debts when the trust unlocks. I need to know the exact figure I'm settling." "You could have had Thomas summarize it." "I don't pay Thomas to manage my future wife's financial ruins," Alistair said. He rubbed his jaw, tracing the faint, invisible line where she had struck him days ago. "I looked at the timber yields, Bexley, just as you demanded." She froze. Her hands gripped the edges of the parchment so tightly her knuckles turned white. "The northern ridge is overlogged," Alistair continued, looking out the carriage window into the wet darkness. "But the southern valley has old-growth oak that hasn't been touched in 3 generations. It's highly valuable. If we structure the logging selectively, it can generate enough capital to sustain your estate's maintenance costs independently within 5 years. Bexley stared at the side of his face. He wasn't mocking her. He wasn't pitying her. He was treating her family's desperate, shameful crisis like a puzzle to be solved. "You read it," she whispered, the anger draining out of her, replaced by a terrifying vulnerability. Alistair turned his head to look at her. The yellow light of the carriage lamp caught the exhaustion in his grey eyes. "I gave you my word. I am many unpleasant things, Bexley, but I am not a liar." She looked down at the papers in her lap. The ink was slightly smudged from where she had written it at 2 in the morning, listening to her father weep in his study downstairs. The smell of cheap gin and despair had permeated her house for years. This man, this cynical, arrogant duke, was casually offering to erase it. 12% is ruinous, Bexley murmured, tracing the numbers with her thumb. He signed them when he was not of sound mind. He signed them when he was drunk, Alistair corrected brutally but quietly. There is no need to dress it up for me. My father signed away my autonomy out of a misplaced, paranoid romanticism. Fathers make messes, we clean them up. The bluntness of his statement hit her in the chest. It was the most comforting thing anyone had said to her in 3 years. No platitudes, no whispered gossip. Just a cold, hard acknowledgement of the mess. Bexley looked back up at him. The air in the carriage suddenly felt very thick, the proximity between them less like an accident and more like a deliberate tether. They were two people chained to the mistakes of dead or broken men, trying to pick the locks with whatever they had. If you selectively log the Southern Valley, Bexley said, her voice steadying, you have to build a new access road. The soil there is clay-heavy. It washes out in the spring rains. Alistair's mouth twitched into a small, lopsided smile. Then we build a stone thoroughfare, with the capital from the trust. That will take 6 months of labour. We have time. The carriage lurched violently as it turned a tight corner, throwing Bexley sideways. She lost her grip on the papers, and they scattered across the floorboards. Alistair reached out to steady her, his large hand clamping firmly around her bare forearm. His skin was warm. The grip was tight, grounding her against the sway of the cab. They both froze. The carriage settled into a smoother rhythm on the cobblestones, but Alistair didn't let go. He looked down at his hand wrapped around her arm, his thumb resting against the erratic pulse at her wrist. Bexley didn't pull away. She stared at his hand, feeling a sudden, confusing rush of adrenaline that had absolutely nothing to do with anger. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant, filled only by the grinding of the wheels and the harsh rhythm of her own breathing. Alistair slowly loosened his grip. He let his hand drop away, clearing his throat. The mask of the detached, cynical Duke slammed back into place, but Bexley saw the slight tremor in his fingers as he reached down to help gather the scattered papers. The fiction they had built for his uncle was supposed to be a battlefield. But as Bexley took the parchment back from him, their knuckles brushing in the dark, she realized the terrifying truth. The friction was starting to generate a spark. Music at Lady Harrington's seasonal ball did not float through the air. It scraped against the eardrums. A string quartet soared away in the corner of the overheated ballroom, fighting a losing battle against the deafening roar of 300 aristocrats trying to out-gossip one another. The air was a suffocating soup of heavy gardenia perfume, roasted meats, and the sharp, sour tang of nervous sweat hidden beneath layers of expensive silk. Bexley stood near a towering column of faux marble, her jaw locked. She wore a dark plum gown, stripped of the excessive lace and ribbons the modiste had tried to push on her. It felt heavy, dragging at her hips, the tight lacing of the corset restricting her breathing to shallow, unsatisfying gasps. She clutched a glass of warm champagne, her knuckles white. "You look as though you are preparing to throw that glass at someone," Alistair murmured, appearing at her side. He moved through the crowded room with an infuriating ease. The sea of taffeta and velvet simply parted for him. He wore stark black, devoid of the colourful waistcoats favoured by the younger lords, looking less like a guest and more like an executioner. "I'm considering it," Bexley replied, not looking at him. She stared straight ahead at the swirling mass of dancers. "Lady Westmore has walked past me 3 times in the last 10 minutes. Each time, she looks at my hemline as though she expects rats to crawl out from beneath it. She is looking at your hemline because her own daughter is currently weeping in the ladies' retiring room," Alistair said, taking a sip from his own glass. They assumed I was waiting for the season's peak to announce a match with their family. You ruined a 2-year investment. My apologies to her stock portfolio. Alistair chuckled, the sound low and dry. Careful, Bexley. Your provincial pragmatism is showing. You are supposed to be blinded by my title, remember? I am blinded by the glare reflecting off Lord Westmore's balding head, she shot back. Alistair shifted closer. His shoulder brushed against hers. The heat radiating from him was a stark contrast to the draught sweeping through the grand windows behind them. My uncle is standing near the punch bowl. He has been watching us since we arrived. He is timing our interactions. Bexley stifled a groan. She glanced to her left, catching a glimpse of Reginald's thick frame, partially obscured by a potted fern. The older man held a pocket watch, his pale eyes fixed on them with a predatory intensity. "What does he want to see?" Bexley asked, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Should I swoon? Should I feed you a strawberry?" "He expects to see possession," Alistair said flatly. "Aristocratic courtships are not about affection, no matter what my father's will claims. They are about ownership. He wants to see if I lay claim to you, and if you submit to it. It's a barbaric metric, but it is the one he understands." Before Bexley could process the word submit, Alistair reached out and plucked the champagne glass from her rigid fingers. He set it on a passing servant's tray without breaking eye contact with her. "Dance with me," he ordered. It wasn't a request. "I don't waltz," Bexley said, her heart giving a sudden violent kick against her ribs. "I step on feet. I ruin shoes." "Then ruin mine." He stepped into her space, invading the small buffer she had carefully maintained. He didn't offer his hand with a polite bow. He took her arm, his grip firm and entirely uncompromising, and pulled her toward the center of the floor. The crowd parted again, whispers hissing through the room like steam escaping a pipe. Bexley felt 100 pairs of eyes locking onto them. Panic, cold and sharp, flared in her chest. She stumbled on her first step, her heel catching on the heavy fabric of her gown. Alistair caught her, his right hand clamped onto her waist, his fingers digging into the stiff boning of her corset. His left hand swallowed her smaller one, lifting it to the correct height. "Stop thinking about them," Alistair commanded, his voice barely audible over the swelling music. "I can't," Bexley hissed, her face burning. "They are staring at me like I am a zoo exhibit." "They are staring at me, Bexley," he corrected, pulling her closer. The gap between them vanished. Her breasts brushed against the rigid wool of his coat. "They are wondering why the ice-cold Duke of Oakhaven is gripping a penniless woman like he intends to drag her out the back door. Let them wonder." He stepped forward, forcing her backward. The waltz began. It was not a graceful, floating affair. It was a physical exertion. Alistair didn't guide her. He drove her. He moved with a harsh, aggressive rhythm, anticipating her missteps and physically hauling her back onto the beat before she could falter. His grip on her waist was entirely ungentlemanly, tight, hot, and demanding. "You are crushing my ribs," Bexley gasped, glaring up at him. "You are stepping on my toes," Alistair replied smoothly, his eyes flashing with that same dark, cynical amusement she had seen at dinner. "Keep moving." "I am moving. You are hauling me around like a sack of grain." "If you were a sack of grain, you would be significantly less argumentative." Bexley let out a sharp, angry laugh. The sound punched through the stifling formality of the room. A few heads snapped in their direction. Aristocratic women did not laugh like that. They tittered behind fans. Alistair's eyes darkened. The amusement faded, replaced by something heavier, something that made the hair on Bexley's arms stand up. He swept her into a tight, dizzying turn. The chandelier above became a blurred streak of violent light. The smell of his cologne wrapped around her, drowning out the gardenias and the roasted meat. For 3 minutes, the rest of the room ceased to exist. There was only the pulling ache in her muscles, the bruising pressure of his hand on her waist, and the friction of their jagged edges grinding together. They were fighting to a 3-4 times signature. When the music finally ground to a halt, Bexley was breathing hard. Her chest heaved, pressing against him. Alistair didn't let go immediately. He stared down at her, his chest rising and falling in time with hers. The mask was slipping again. The line between the farce and the reality was blurring, smudged by adrenaline and heat. "Look at the fern," Alistair whispered, his voice thick. Bexley turned her head slightly. Lord Reginald stood by the punch bowl. His pocket watch snapped shut. The suspicion was gone from his pale eyes, replaced by a deep, unsettled frown. He had seen the tight grip, the angry laugh, the undeniable, raw tension. He had seen possession. Alistair finally stepped back, the loss of his body heat leaving Bexley suddenly, violently cold. He offered her his arm, his expression snapping back into a mask of polite indifference. "Come," he said, "let us find you another terrible glass of champagne." Morning light did not penetrate the windows of the Linfield estate. It surrendered on the glass, defeated by years of accumulated grime. Bexley stood in the entryway of her childhood home, her stomach churning. The smell hit her the moment she unlocked the door, a distinct, nauseating blend of spilled gin, rotting apples, and damp, decaying wood. She had returned only to pack a small trunk of personal items. Alistair had insisted she move to a guest wing of his townhouse, citing the need for public appearances and the convenience of his carriage. It was a logical demand, but standing in her ruined foyer, the contrast between his world of polished limestone and her world of rotting floorboards felt physically sickening. "Father!" she called out, her voice echoing in the empty hall. Silence answered. He was likely passed out in his study, or perhaps he hadn't come home from the taverns. It was Tuesday. Tuesday was always a bad day. Bexley walked toward the stairs, her boots echoing sharply. She just needed her mother's jewellery box and the few heavy winter skirts she owned. She could be in and out in 10 minutes. "Miss Linfield," the voice came from the shadows of the sitting room. It was not her father. It was a nasal, wet sound that made the back of Bexley's neck prickle. A man stepped into the dim light of the hallway. He was short, wearing a cheap, ill-fitting brown suit that smelled strongly of onions and old tobacco. He held a bowler hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. Bexley froze, her hand gripping the wooden banister. Mr. Finch, Elias Finch, was a debt collector. He wasn't the sort of man who worked for reputable banks. He worked for the shadow lenders, the men who charged 12% compound interest and collected with bruised knuckles rather than court orders. "Your father isn't here, miss," Finch said, taking a step closer. The floorboards whined under his heavy boots. "We had an appointment this morning. He seems to have forgotten. My father's affairs are being managed," Bexley said, forcing her voice to remain steady. She stood up straighter, channeling the cold arrogance she had watched Alistair wield for a week. "You will be contacted by our solicitors before the end of the month." Finch smiled. It was an ugly expression, revealing a row of greying teeth. "Solicitors? That's a fancy word for a family that can't afford coal. I don't want a solicitor, Miss Linfield. I want the £400 owed on the primary note, today." "I do not have £400. Then we have a problem," Finch said, his tone dropping the polite facade. He closed the distance between them with terrifying speed, trapping her against the base of the stairs. He reached out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was entirely different from Alistair's. It was sweaty, pinching, meant to cause pain. "Let go of me," Bexley demanded, yanking her arm. He held fast. "Your father told me about the Duke," Finch sneered, leaning in. His breath was foul. "Told me you hooked the biggest fish in Mayfair. So, you are going to go to your fancy new Duke, and you are going to ask him for an advance on your allowance. Or I start taking collateral. This house, the furniture, maybe that pretty little—" The heavy oak front door didn't just open. It slammed into the wall with a deafening crack that shook plaster from the ceiling. Finch flinched, dropping Bexley's wrist. Alistair stood in the doorway. He wore a heavy riding coat, a riding crop still clutched in his leather-gloved right hand. The grey light from the street silhouetted him, making him look massive. He didn't look tired. He didn't look bored. He looked lethal. Alistair stepped into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing them in the gloom. He didn't look at Bexley. His eyes, cold and entirely devoid of human warmth, locked onto Finch. "Who are you?" Alistair asked. The baritone of his voice didn't echo. It absorbed all the sound in the room. Finch puffed out his chest, trying to regain his bravado. "Elias Finch. I hold the markers on this property. I have a legal right to—" "I did not ask for your biography," Alistair interrupted softly. He took slow, measured steps forward. The riding crop tapped rhythmically against the side of his leather boot. Tap, tap, tap. "I asked who you were. Now I see. You are a trespasser." "I am a creditor," Finch barked, though he took a step back. "And if you're the Duke of Oakhaven, you owe me £400 on behalf of this miserable family." Alistair stopped 3 feet from the man. "I owe you nothing. If you hold a legitimate note, present it to my secretary at my estate. If you ever set foot in this house again, or if you ever touch my fiancée again, I will not call the magistrate." Alistair leaned down slightly, bringing his face level with the shorter man's. "I will have my men drag you into the southern woods of my property," Alistair whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the dead silence of the hall. "I will have them break both of your legs with iron rods, and then I will leave you there. It takes 3 days to die of exposure in the winter. Do you understand me, Mr. Finch?" Bexley stopped breathing. She stared at Alistair's profile. This wasn't a bluff. The absolute, sociopathic calm in his voice was horrifying. This was the raw, unchecked power of a duke who answered to no one. Finch swallowed hard. The bravado dissolved completely. His face went pale, his eyes darting toward the door. "The note is legal," he muttered weakly. "Present it to Thomas," Alistair repeated, stepping aside. "Get out." Finch didn't hesitate. He scrambled past Alistair, nearly tripping over his own boots as he yanked the front door open and practically ran down the gravel path. The silence returned, heavier this time. Bexley leaned back against the banister, rubbing her red wrist. Her knees felt weak. She had spent her entire life fighting men like Finch, screaming at them, negotiating, begging. Alistair had dismissed him in 60 seconds with a promise of extreme violence. Alistair stood still for a long moment, staring at the closed door. Then he let out a harsh breath, dragging a leather-clad hand through his hair. He turned to her, the terrifying mask of the Duke melting away, leaving behind the exhausted, cynical man she had met in the study. "Are you injured?" he asked, his voice rough. "No," Bexley said, her voice shaking slightly. She looked down at her wrist, then back up at him. "You threatened to murder him." "It was highly effective. You aren't a monster, Alistair. You shouldn't say things like that." Alistair closed the distance between them, stopping just inches away. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "You demanded the truth from me the day we met, Bexley. The truth is, I am a monster to men like him. I have to be. It is the only currency they understand." He reached out slowly, his gloved fingers brushing gently against her bruised wrist. The leather was cold, but the touch was impossibly light. "Pack your trunk," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers. "You are not coming back to this house." Sunlight crept through the towering velvet curtains of the Mayfair townhouse, casting long, sharp blades of illumination across the Persian rug. Bexley sat in a leather armchair in the library, staring at her own hands. Her cuticles were finally healing, the raw edges softening after a week of almond oil and idleness. It felt wrong. Her body was braced for a fight, but her environment demanded leisure. The heavy mahogany doors clicked open, breaking the stifling silence. Bexley expected Thomas, bearing another tray of tasteless, perfectly steeped chamomile tea. Instead, the heavy scent of stale tobacco and heavy pomade rolled into the room before the man even crossed the threshold. Lord Reginald Croft stepped inside, closing the doors behind him with a definitive, hollow thud. He wore a tailored morning coat, but his collar seemed too tight for his thick neck. He didn't ask for permission to sit. He simply took the armchair opposite Bexley, his watery pale eyes fixing on her like a jeweller inspecting a flawed diamond. "My nephew is currently at his solicitor's office on Chancery Lane," Reginald stated, pulling a silver cigar case from his breast pocket. He didn't offer her one, nor did he light his own. He merely turned the cold metal over in his thick fingers. "Which means we have approximately an hour to speak without his aggressive posturing. I have nothing to say to you, Lord Reginald, that I wouldn't say in front of Alistair," Bexley replied evenly. Her pulse kicked up, a slow, warning drumbeat in her ears. "Admirable loyalty," Reginald drawled, the sarcasm heavy and wet. "But entirely unnecessary. I know what this is, Miss Linfield. I have reviewed the sudden, rather aggressive restructuring of your father's promissory notes. Alistair is liquidating his personal, unentailed assets to buy off the shadow lenders hovering around your estate." Bexley's breath hitched, just a fraction. Alistair hadn't told her that. He had said he was handling it, implying he was using his existing leverage, not selling off his own private holdings before the trust unlocked. Reginald caught the micro-expression. A slow, ugly smile stretched across his face. "He didn't tell you. How tragic. He's selling his mother's hunting lodge in Kent to keep your father out of debtor's prison. It is a desperate, foolish maneuver to convince me that his affection for you is genuine enough to warrant unlocking the Oakhaven Trust." Reginald leaned forward, the leather of his chair groaning under his weight. He reached into his coat and produced a folded slip of heavy bank paper. He tossed it onto the low table between them. It landed with a soft, dismissive slap. £50,000, Reginald said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Drawn from my personal accounts. It is more than enough to clear your father's ledgers and establish you in a comfortable, quiet life in the country. Take it. Break the engagement. Walk out that door before he returns." Bexley looked at the paper. It was a staggering sum of money. It was safety. It was the absolute end of the gnawing, humiliating panic that had defined the last 3 years of her life. She reached out. Her fingers brushed the stiff, expensive parchment. Reginald's smile widened, a sound of triumph rumbling in his chest. "Poverty breeds pragmatism. Your own words, Miss Linfield." Bexley picked up the draft. The ink was dark, the signature jagged and arrogant. She felt the heavy silence of the library pressing down on her shoulders. She thought of the cold, draughty halls of her childhood home. She thought of the smell of cheap gin. Then she thought of Alistair. She thought of the raw, violent way he had inserted himself between her and Elias Finch. She thought of his exhaustion, the way he rubbed his ink-stained fingers against his bruised jaw. She remembered the carriage ride, the absolute, unvarnished honesty in his grey eyes when he promised to clean up her father's mess. Alistair was trapped in a gilded cage built by a dead man, surrounded by vultures like Reginald, who were simply waiting for him to starve. Bexley folded the bank draft in half. Then she folded it again. "You misunderstand pragmatism, my lord," Bexley said, her voice dropping into a low, steady register. She held the thick square of paper up. "Pragmatism is recognizing a bad investment. You want me to take your money so you can declare Alistair in breach of the will. You want to dissolve the trust, seize the principal capital, and leave him with a bankrupt title. You don't care about the sanctity of marriage. You are just a parasite waiting for the host to die." Reginald's face flushed a deep, mottled purple. "You insolent little—" "I am not finished," Bexley snapped, the aristocratic veneer shattering completely, revealing the street fighter underneath. She leaned forward, mirroring his aggressive posture. "Alistair does not treat me like a transaction. You do. He read my ledgers. He saw the ruin of my family, and instead of using it to control me, he used his own assets to shield me. That is not a corporate merger. That is a partnership." She tossed the folded bank draft back onto the table. It slid across the polished mahogany, coming to rest against Reginald's silver cigar case. "Keep your money," Bexley said, her voice entirely devoid of fear. "I am marrying the Duke of Oakhaven, and if you attempt to block the trust execution tomorrow, I will personally stand before the House of Lords and detail exactly how you attempted to bribe a penniless woman to destroy your own nephew." Reginald stared at her. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the smell of old paper and the sharp tang of Bexley's adrenaline. The older man's eyes searched her face, looking for the bluff, looking for the lie. He found a brick wall. Slowly, Reginald sat back. The purple flush faded, leaving him looking suddenly very old and entirely defeated. He looked at the bank draft, then back to Bexley. He had demanded proof of a genuine, fiercely protective match. Bexley had just handed it to him, wrapped in barbed wire. "You are a terrifying creature, Miss Linfield," Reginald muttered, his voice hoarse. "I learned from the best," Bexley replied, not breaking eye contact. "Now get out of my chair." The fire in Alistair's study had burned down to glowing red embers, casting a dim, hellish light across the scattered books and ledgers. The air was thick with the scent of pine smoke and the sharp bite of amber brandy. Alistair stood by the window, staring out into the pitch-black London rain. He had discarded his coat and cravat hours ago. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exposing the hard lines of his forearms. He looked like a man who had survived a war, only to realize he had no home to return to. The door clicked open. Bexley stepped into the study. She wore a simple wool dress, the expensive emerald velvet packed away in her trunk upstairs. Alistair didn't turn around. "Thomas told me my uncle paid you a visit today." "He did," Bexley said. She walked toward the center of the room. Her boots made no sound on the thick Persian rug. "He brought a bank draft, £50,000. Alistair's shoulders flinched, a microscopic tightening of muscle beneath his shirt. He closed his eyes, his forehead resting against the cold window pane. "I assume you are packed, then. Thomas can arrange a carriage to take you wherever you wish to go." "I didn't take it." Alistair froze. He turned around slowly, the embers catching the deep exhaustion etched into the lines around his mouth. "What?" "I told him to keep his money," Bexley said, stopping a few feet away from the heavy mahogany desk. "I also told him that if he didn't sign the trust execution, I would ruin him in front of the House of Lords." Alistair stared at her, his grey eyes wide, processing the words. He walked over to the desk, his movements stiff. He picked up a thick stack of vellum parchment bound in red ribbon. The wax seal of the Oakhaven executor was pressed heavily into the bottom corner. "He signed it," Alistair said, his voice entirely hollow. "He sent this over by courier an hour ago. The trust is unlocked, the estate is secure. Then we won." Bexley felt a strange, twisting pain in her chest. The victory felt entirely like a funeral. Alistair set the documents down. He picked up a smaller, unsealed envelope and held it out to her. "I went to Chancery Lane today. Your father's debts, the predatory notes, the compounding interest, Finch, they are completely liquidated. The deeds to your estate are clear. This is the proof." Bexley took the envelope. Her fingers brushed his, but he pulled back immediately, putting physical distance between them. "You are free, Bexley," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "The farce is over. You don't have to marry a cynical, exhausted man you despise. You have your home back. You have your life." Bexley stared down at the envelope. This was the moment she had fantasized about for 3 years. Absolute financial freedom. But the paper felt cold and meaningless in her hands. She looked up at Alistair. He had retreated behind the brick wall, locking himself away inside his limestone fortress, refusing to look at her as anything other than a successfully closed ledger. "You sold your mother's hunting lodge," Bexley said quietly. Alistair's jaw tightened. It was an unentailed asset. It was the fastest way to secure the capital before the trust. "You didn't know if Reginald was going to sign the release," Bexley interrupted, taking a step closer. The anger was back, but it wasn't the ugly, exhaustion-fueled rage from their first meeting. It was a fierce, protective heat. "You sold your own property to pay my father's debts before you even knew if our trap would work. Why?" "Because you shouldn't be bound to me by a debt," Alistair snapped, his control finally cracking. He planted his hands on the desk, leaning toward her. "Because you looked at me in that carriage with absolute terror, and I realized I was becoming exactly the kind of monster my uncle is. I wanted you to have a choice, Bexley. I wanted you to be able to walk away." "You idiot," Bexley breathed. She dropped the envelope. It hit the mahogany desk with a soft slide. She didn't stop moving. She stepped around the desk, invading his space, just as he had done to her on the dance floor. Alistair straightened up, his eyes darting to her face, confused and entirely disarmed. Bexley reached up. She didn't swing her hand in a tight, fast arc. Instead, she pressed her palm gently against the exact spot on his jaw where she had struck him a week ago. Her fingers traced the faint shadow of his stubble. His skin was burning hot. Alistair inhaled sharply, his chest expanding, his hands hovering uselessly at his sides as if he was afraid to touch her. 99 women came into this room and offered you a business merger," Bexley whispered, looking up into his fractured grey eyes. "I came in here and demanded the truth, so I'm going to give you the truth in return." She stepped closer, the wool of her dress brushing against his trousers. "I don't despise you, Alistair. I despise the world that forced us to play this game. But I don't despise you. I am not leaving." Alistair looked down at her, the last remnants of his cynical armor shattering into dust. He brought his hands up, gripping her waist just as tightly as he had at the ball. But this time, there was no audience. There was no performance. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, letting out a long, ragged breath that sounded like a man who had finally stopped drowning. "Then make me a proposal, Miss Linfield," he murmured against her skin, his voice thick with raw, unchecked emotion. Bexley smiled, wrapping her arms around his broad shoulders, pulling him against her. The smell of pine smoke and bergamot surrounded her, and for the first time in her life, she felt entirely safe. "Marry me, Your Grace," she whispered. "Yes, did this unconventional romance leave you breathless? If you loved watching Bexley break down the Duke's icy walls and demand the raw truth, tap that like button right now. Don't forget to share this story with fellow historical drama fans who crave fierce heroines and deeply grounded, emotional tension over predictable clichés. Want more original stories filled with sensory details, sharp banter, and imperfect characters finding real love? Hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next full-length storytelling experience. Drop a comment below. Would you have slapped the Duke?